something about all the injustices that he sees. Now, he's looking around at Jerusalem. He's looking around at the people of God. And he sees all these injustices. And he says, why don't you do something about that? And God says, okay, I'll do something about it. I want to bring a nation that's worse, and they're gonna punish you. He says, whoa, let's back up a second. That's not what I meant. You know, and then he gives a second complaint.
That's fine if you don't mind.
Request.
But did you get his on there?
God says, hey, you just have to be faithful. Okay? Well, Habakkuk 2 verse 4, we'll get to that in just a minute. But then Habakkuk, he kind of comes around. He actually, part of his message is a message which is, he recognizes that they are eventually going to get what's coming to them. But then in chapter 3, I think is the real culmination of his message for us. And that is Habakkuk's ability to say, well, whatever comes, I'm still going to be faithful. Whatever happens, but I stand with, can we say Joshua? You know, famous passage in Joshua chapter 24. As for me and my house will serve the Lord. And you see this a lot in the Psalms. You see this a lot with David. David struggles with what happens. David wonders at times where God is. You know, he makes requests of guys. You know, well, where are you? You're hiding your face from me. And eventually he comes around and he expresses faith as well. You know, I'm still going to be faithful even though things aren't working out quite the way I feel like they should be working out. So, a couple of introductory things. He is a contemporary of Zephaniah, who, by the way, will be next lesson. Okay, they prophesied around the same time, and Zephaniah has got some interesting, very interesting context of Zephaniah. So I would encourage you not only to read Zephaniah for next time, but read some things in 2 Kings about Josiah's reign. Most of us know Josiah because we look at him as a great reformer. Okay? But Zephaniah is prophesying during the reign of Josiah, and it kind of seemed like a little bit of a contradiction. Habakkuk is in the last stages of the kingdom of Judah in the early 600s. About 587, that the final destruction of Jerusalem takes place by the Babylonians. Certainly before Jerusalem's destruction, both Habakkuk and Zephaniah warn of her downfall. Okay, they're just prophesying some things that are going to happen to that group, and it's not really all that pretty. Judah has basically gotten worse than Israel. And it's also just prior to the same time period as Ezekiel and Jeremiah. It's kind of interesting to me that sometimes the most prolific prophetic activity occurs during times that are not going so well. Ezekiel and Jeremiah, now of course Isaiah is maybe a little bit of a contradiction to that statement, and there's some of the smaller prophets, but during Elijah's reign, Elijah and Elisha, I mean, they worked during a time of great apostasy. A lot of idolatry. Ahab's reign, Jezebel's reign during those times, okay? But then you get Ezekiel and Jeremiah, and they occur during a very similar time period. And God is sending them along. Jeremiah works in Jerusalem. Ezekiel is with the exiles over in Babylon. He gets taken away with the first wave of exiles. And Ezekiel has some very strong words to tell them as well. So we're in that same time period where all this is going to happen. And there's a lot of idolatry, a lot of unfaithfulness, and the prophets are there to keep trying to pull them back. And they seem not to be able to do that. As we'll see next week, or excuse me, 2 weeks. I'm not here next week because I'm on vacation. Okay. Ron knows that, so hopefully, I don't know, Ron, you going to teach next week?
Yep.
Okay.
Jeremiah.
Okay, you can teach
a major prophet.
All right. Okay, that'll be interesting. You You gonna cover all of his complaints?
No, just one chapter.
Tell you, sometimes the way God allows his prophets to be treated, you wonder why he would want to be one. But as we'll see next week in Zephaniah, Josiah's reforms, you know, we look at Josiah as a great man, and truly he was, but it was kind of too little too late. Okay? And maybe there's some other reasons we need to think about that. So, I substituted this a little bit here because I think that sometimes we can come to God with what we might consider complaints. We don't understand what God is doing. You know, Paul says in Philippians, present your requests to God. Well, you know, we're not always feeling good when we come to pray. I don't know about you, but I'm not always feeling good when I go to pray to God. I don't understand some things that go on. I'm not feeling good. Sometimes I'm not even feeling like I got the right words to say to God.
Well, we've got the Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. But the fact is, Habakkuk comes to him with some things that he sees he wants God to take care of. Now, I don't think he's your average complainer. I don't think Habakkuk is the kind of people that we see in the desert with Israel, you know, and always complaining about this and always complaining about that, and just nothing's ever right. God, you're just not ever doing anything right. I don't think that's what Habakkuk is doing here, and I don't think that's what we do when we come to God with questions, puzzles, mysteries. You know, I don't understand why God does what He does sometimes, and I think it's okay to feel that once in a while. We're not going to fully understand a God who's so much bigger than we are. Our mind is not His mind. Okay. And that's both good, maybe, and bad, because we don't understand, but it's good as well because God's so much bigger and more loving and more willing to reconcile than we ever are. And we'll see that in Habakkuk. Okay, and some really beautiful passages there. Yeah.
That's kind of good in a way because we just follow God by faith.
Yeah.
That's what they had to do then. That's what we have to do now.
Yeah. Yeah. Clearly, that's the message that Habakkuk has to deal with as well. His is more of a complaint seeking understanding. All right? It's not a complaint just wanting to whine. His is a complaint seeking understanding, if we can call it a complaint. But I think there's a way we do that times, at least I think, in my faith. I just have that kind of sense of that from time to time. I try to understand things. I'm not always going to get that understanding. It's always going to be by faith. Okay? Yeah. But I think that's what he's doing here. Okay? He sees this lack of retribution against evil. And last time I was here, I mentioned a couple of Psalms. Psalm 37, Psalm 73 are both statements about that same thing. The psalmists are wondering why does it seem like the bad guys have it good? And he doesn't get that, and he's wondering why God doesn't address this evil that's going on. And he knows God is that kind of God who does address evil, but God's first answer is just not what he expects. He brings punishment from an unrighteous nation. This seems outside the bounds of God's nature and Habakkuk's sense of justice. That's the problem that Habakkuk is dealing with in his own mind. He doesn't see that God is really doing what he thinks God is supposed to do. What he knows of the nature of God. We know God is a God of justice and of mercy. And Habakkuk he's in an environment where apparently it's pretty, just pretty awful. That's my guess. You know, Isaiah will often talk about the bloodshed that's apparent in Jerusalem, and that was well before the time of Habakkuk. Okay, he sees all that and he says, "This is not good. These are really, you know, pretty bad folks." Let me say it that way. His answer, or God's answer, is Habakkuk 2, verse 4. The righteous will live by his faith. Very interesting passage here. In Habakkuk 2:4, it actually reads this way. Look, his ego is inflated. He is without integrity, but the righteous one will live by his faith. Now, in verse 4, he's talking about the people that Habakkuk is complaining about. Okay, he doesn't have any sense of integrity. He's arrogant. And so the contrast here is, okay, you got this guy over here, you don't like him. And probably, well, you shouldn't. He's not a person of integrity. You don't get along with him. You don't fit into that category. But here's what my righteous one is expected to do. You have to live by your faith. Okay? You can't allow them to influence you one way or the other. You can't allow them to be the type of, to make you their type of people. All right? And in the midst of all that, he says, I expect you to do what you're expected to do. And the context is, as we've said, God is acting in a mysterious way in an unfaithful world. You know, I'm sure the church of the first century was quite perplexed, and it's probably why God gave the revelation to John, the book of Revelation to John. He was trying to encourage them. I mean, if there's any message in the book of Revelation, it's, hey, God's going to win. Now, it's in the midst of a horrible battle, and, you know, the church is struggling. There were probably, from what I understand, I'm not sure if we're just reading into the text or not, but it's very possible the church wondered, are we going to survive? Okay. Living through people like all the different Roman emperors. Okay. How's this going to work? How are we going to manage? Well, God gives John this revelation and said, yeah, look, there's a war going on. You're kind of caught in the middle of it, but you're gonna win if you'll only remain faithful. So the message is not unusual here, that God is acting in a mysterious way in an unfaithful world. It's God's way of dealing with it, not ours. Paul adapts this verse in Romans 1:17. He quotes this, which I find very interesting because of the way I think sometimes we've taken this passage. Sometimes we've understood Romans 1:17, the righteous will live by faith, as if faith here just means raw belief. Well, faith has two sides to it, doesn't it? It not only means belief, but it means trust or faithfulness. Not just belief, it means faithfulness. All right? And I think that we need to kind of throw that into the mix, even in the book of Romans, even though the theme there is, look, the Jews and the Gentiles can have this faith, and therefore it's by faith. Okay. I don't want to go into this too much right now, but I would encourage you to just, Romans, there's a couple of bookends in the book of Romans that I kind of find fascinating. And one is in Romans 1:5, and the other is in Romans 16:26. Paul uses this phrase that he wants, above all else, for his listeners to strive for the obedience that comes by faith, or the obedience of faith. And he connects obedience with faith in a way that to me sounds like faithfulness. Okay? He's asking simply people to be faithful. Not just to have raw belief, but to actually be faithful in everything they do. So anyway, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. In fact, I have a question. Maybe we'll deal with that as we get a little bit further along. Quick outline. There's the first complaint with God's answer. We've already discussed that a little bit. Second complaint with God's answer. Chapter 2, 5 through 17 is a warning to the Babylonians. Okay? They're not getting off scot-free. I don't know if God says this just to make Habakkuk feel a little better, but the fact is they're not getting off scot-free here. Okay? So he warns the Babylonians that he's their God as well. And of course, this little thing in the middle, I'm not sure why he throws this in there. This is kind of a little bit of mystery to me, the futility of idols. Just a couple of verses about it. And I'm sure it's always been something the prophets have talked about, okay, that there's always the futility of worshiping things that cannot save you. All right? But he throws that in. And then, of course, chapter 3, verses 1 through 19 the prophet's prayer and his expression of faith. I think we have a question about that. We'll get to that in just a minute. But really verses 16 through 19 are, I think, one of the more profound statements of faith I think you'll find anywhere in the Bible. Basically, he says, no matter what happens, if I don't get the things that I need in my life, I'm still going to be faithful. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but just the way he says it, there's a certain poetry about it, but it's a pretty profound expression. Pretty dramatic considering the situation that's happening. He's got to watch Jerusalem be destroyed. Now, I don't know whether Habakkuk lived to see the actual destruction take place, but he knows it's coming, and it's grievous to him. Okay? It's grievous to him. Okay. Habakkuk wonders how long God will right the injustices he sees. Have you ever experienced an injustice or known of someone who did?
Yeah.
Yes. I think all of us have known that or known of someone who did. Life isn't fair. I had a minister friend of mine in New Jersey that he had some foster kids, and this is a little over the top as far as I'm concerned, but one of the first things he would say to them when they came into his house is, look, I'm going to tell you something right now. Life is unfair and then you die. That's a little over the top, okay? That's even more depressing than I think some people say the book of Ecclesiastes is. Which, by the way, I don't think it is, but that's another whole lesson. Okay, life is unfair. It's not, in fact, in the book of Ecclesiastes, there's some statements in there about I've seen the injustices that occur in this world. Okay? And, the writer is just simply saying that it's just going to be a part of your life. Will you have the opportunity to change it? Maybe. I think one of the best things I think I have ever seen, well, several actually. I forget this guy's name who had it. His little boy got kidnapped and killed. But then he made this program to try to catch some of the most wanted. What was his name? Somebody remember his name?
John Walsh is the dad.
Adam was the child. Okay. John something. I forget his last name. John what? Walsh. Yes, John Walsh. Okay. That's probably one of the best ways of taking your grief and doing something positive with it. That would be one of the hardest things to do. Mm-hmm. There was another situation, and I don't know if I want to say it was close to home, but you guys remember the Duke lacrosse team a couple of years ago? They were accused of sexually molesting some black girl at Duke. Turned out it was totally not true. They were exonerated. But one of the things that I read, and the reason that's kind of close to me is because some of those kids lived in the area in New Jersey where they played lacrosse. I don't know if they ever played against my son, but they played our team, okay, or they played against our team. So I kind of knew of the area, knew where they had come from. But I read that some of those young men, after all that had happened, they had decided that they were going to become lawyers and work for some groups that were trying to make sure that people were not accused unjustly. Now, that's pretty amazing to me that somebody could do that. Okay? That they would say, we know what it's like, we're going to try to change it. Okay? We're going to use our talents to try to do something better in the world. Injustices are just always going to be there. Remember the widow and the unjust judge in Luke 18. You can tell me that story. A woman goes to an unjust judge. What does she do?
is the one that continues the petition.
She pleads her case over and over again. How does the unjust judge react? I mean, it clearly says this guy is not a just judge. He probably takes bribes. You know, he's not, he doesn't care about justice. He doesn't really even care about her. What does he care about? She's just wearing him out. She keeps coming, and she keeps coming, and she keeps coming. And God says, listen to what the unjust judge says. You know, I'll bring justice quickly. And I have sometimes wondered, yeah, how quickly is God's quickly? I'm not really sure.
You never know.
No, you don't. You know, I think that's also part of the struggle here. All right? He doesn't know how quickly it's going to happen, or she doesn't. We don't. Habakkuk didn't. You know, it wasn't going to be till quite a while later when the Babylonians finally got their just desserts in a way. Ron?
That was like the first verse of that story. Jesus told it because he was saying you ought to pray and not give up.
Not give up, yes.
And that's the subject of our Wednesday night class that John is teaching, and that's something we need to remember. Our timetable is not God.
No.
But God is never late.
Yeah, yeah. John?
All of this kind of presents a dilemma in my mind a little bit. You know, Habakkuk and some of the other prophets, like you say, they had this complaint and everything, and then God answers them, and they're like, "You're right, God. I trust you and everything." And so sometimes I don't know for sure what message I'm supposed to take from that with regard to, and with what Ron just brought up, is the message that God's sending us, quit your complaining, I'm in control. And so then you have the verses about judge not lest you be judged, and you have our current kind of society dialogue where you can't say anything unless you're perfect.
Yeah.
And so these guys are calling out bad things like they're not evil. They're righteous, some would say self-righteous. And so like Ron's talking about, so we pray and we don't give up. But when we pray certain things, it's kind of our complaint, like you said, or our request or whatever.
Yeah.
And yet Habakkuk learned these lessons. Job learned these lessons. A lot of these guys learned their lessons. They, okay, God, it's in your hands.
Right.
And so it just, in my mind, it creates this dilemma about, should I just not think about all those injustices and pray about them, or do I just bother God every day with what I think of the injustices? It just, I don't know, it's just kind of a dilemma in my
Yeah,
mind.
no, it does create that. Anybody have an answer for him? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we have to look at it, we need to try and look at it as the whole picture, not just the little viewpoint with our blinders on. I think God puts us, okay, like with Paul, he prayed that the thorn be removed from the flesh. Sometimes it's for the individual, sometimes it's for a population or maybe even a nation. But God puts us in situations sometimes so we can shine. We're supposed to be the light like the house on the hill.
Right.
He wants us, I mean, everyone's got injustice, like you said. I mean, whether it's in a small place or larger or grande, like you say in Spanish, a big thing, we all face injustices. How does a Christian go through the injustice the same as a worldly person goes through injustice? God wants us to shine for him as we go through the injustices. We don't have to understand the injustices. We just have to be faithful to him as we go through them. And we should be standing out as lights compared to what the worldly person would do in that.
Right. Well, my response, John, is I just pray about it anyway. You know, I still sense the dilemma. I don't, there are times when I don't have the words. There are times when I'm frustrated. You know, you look at what's going on today, and it's pretty awful, some pretty awful things going on right now.
Yeah.
And I don't know, and I don't want to justify complaining to God, but you know, you read through the Psalms, and they're not shy about just kind of going up to God and say, God, where are you? This is not right. This isn't working for me. Okay? And I think we should at least feel like, all right, maybe that's where I am in the process, but am I working toward the greater goal of really being faithful? Which the answer is obviously yes, that's the goal. But everybody's in a different place in the process. I really don't like it when we tell people who are going through struggles like this that we just don't have enough faith. I feel like saying, well, they probably know they don't, you know? But they are struggling, and David struggled, and Habakkuk is struggling, and you know, I think it's just part of it. You know, what does Israel mean? It means he struggles with God. That's what the name means. So I really don't think we're wise to be able to just sort of blithely just tell people, well, you just don't have enough faith. Well, I'm struggling here. How else can you help me? You know, it seems like that's the way we ought to approach people who are having those kinds of things. Maybe we're not in that situation. Maybe we've gone all the way to the expression of faith like Habakkuk has, but other people, they're not there yet. So I think we need to recognize that. Yeah.
Well, he's our outlet, and he's one, like our counselor, and we can talk to him and complain. It's not good to go out and complain to everybody else.
Right.
It's a waste.
Right.
But to him, and the more we talk, sometimes the more you figure things out, maybe through the Spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's like, you know, talking to somebody else. They may not do anything but listen. They may not give you an answer, and sometimes you don't need to feel like you have to give an answer. Maybe people just need to talk a little bit, kind of get it off their chest. I don't know. Everybody's different. Everybody's at a different point in their faith. Yeah, that's part of the struggle with getting up preaching to a big crowd. You know, you want to be able to give something for everybody. Well, what you say one week may not strike people who, you know, some people some week. So you just do the best you can. All right, well, let's move on to something else. In the second complaint, beginning in 1:12, what part of God's nature, to what part of God's nature does the prophet appeal? Chapter 1, verse 12. Whoops. Are you not from eternity, Lord my God, my Holy One? You will not die. Lord, you appointed them to execute judgment. My rock, you destined them to punish us. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and you cannot tolerate wrongdoing. So why do you tolerate those who are treacherous? What's he appealing to there, Larry?
When I first read that about that your eyes are too pure to look on evil, I immediately thought of Jesus on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Jesus took upon himself
All of it.
all of what allegedly God does not look upon. Not allegedly, but you know what I'm saying. It was a mysterious kind of way to approach reconciliation with humanity.
Is he questioning God's fairness?
Kind of sounds like it to me. I mean, he's at least appealing to. Again, if you read Psalm 37 or Psalm 73, you would know it's kind of the same thing. I don't understand why the bad guys seem to have it so good. Why don't you just send your lightning bolt and zap them right away? Well, it's kind of good for us in a way. God doesn't always do that either. Immediately. You look back at your own life, or maybe even in your life today, you know, there's some things that we do or say that may fall under the judgment of God. And yet, you know, he still, well, no, God doesn't look on those things. we're in a day and age when we know that God has dealt with them through the cross. But the fact is, a lot of people are kind of recognizing that, yeah.
One thing that I think helps me to try to develop that patience or get rid of the impatience that you have with God to deal with things is Paul's perspective, where, you know, Paul says, I'm the chief sinner. And so if I just remember that if I want God to strike down all evil, that includes me. So I don't want him to strike me down, so I've got to be patient with the rest of it, I guess.
Right. It is an important part of God's nature, isn't it? That God does not tolerate. You know, the appeal does sound kind of legitimate to me. I don't know that Habakkuk was a person who lacked mercy. I think maybe Habakkuk was the person who recognized what God expected of us, what harm people were doing by the injustices that he saw. Okay? And therefore, he said to God, why are you going to let, I mean, is this all that different from saying, why are you letting the innocent victims just suffer? Yeah, I hear.
We have to look at it like Job or anything. God's the one that set this up.
Right.
And we had to look at it from that viewpoint because he set things up in our lives.
Right.
At least he was respectable. He said, okay, God, he came to him with respect, not disrespect. I don't agree with what you're doing or whatever. He did it with respect.
Yeah.
And we can petition God if we don't understand things are going on. God, I'm having a hard time with this. Please help me to see it.
Right.
But God is the one that set this up with the Babylonians.
Yeah.
He's the one that set it up with the devil to go against Job. And we have to understand that he works in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, again, that's why I don't think Habakkuk is your average complainer, you know, your average grumbler. I think he's just one who's really struggling with what he knows about God,
You know,
what he sees in the world.
in a way, Habakkuk and really some of the other prophets do the same thing. They're really kind of standing up for injustice to God, that God, these people are disrespecting you. You want better, you deserve better,
Right.
you demand better. And of course, this is God talking through all of this. And so it also, I think, shows us how God feels about, I think God feels disrespected by us and so forth, you know. And yet he at the end shows his patience and that he's, you know, but in a way, Habakkuk's like, God, you really deserve better than this. He's not so much, doesn't seem like talking about like people are doing things that hurt Habakkuk.
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah, maybe not. Yeah.
you know, it's hurting you, God.
Yeah.
It's,
Yeah. Yeah. Ron?
I was thinking about Revelation that you mentioned earlier, and those martyrs saying how long. And it, because we are time bound, and we might be the ones suffering, we're always going to want it to end and say, how long do I have to live through this?
Yeah.
Now, from God's standpoint, the Northern Kingdom was wiped out in 720-ish,
Yeah.
and these guys are going to get it 140 years later. So that's like it happened in 1880, and here we are today. God's given them all this time to change their ways, and they haven't done it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
he's being patient and long-suffering like we
Yeah.
know he is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's not happening.
Yeah. By the way, we're dealing with some pretty strong meat here today, aren't we? In terms of our spiritual food. I'm not giving you milk today. Habakkuk is not milk. Habakkuk is strong meat. This is dealing with some just difficult issues. This is the kind of thing that I think Christians deal with, that people of God deal with. I just thought I'd throw that out there that, you know, I just feel like the minor prophets they have a lot of that. That's part of what I think is good about it. For those of us who are, trying to move our spiritual lives to another level, we need to kind of be able to have some of this food. God answers the prophet's complaints by telling him that he must be faithful. Compare the situation with the context where Paul uses this verse in Romans 1:17. Do you think both verses have the same meaning? Paul using it in the same way, or is he just sort of adapting it for his own purpose? Somebody get Romans 1:16 and 17 for me. Let's read those. I think it's 16 and 17.
I'm not ashamed of the gospel, because it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes, first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. For in the gospel a righteousness from God is revealed, a righteousness that is by faith from first to last, just as it is written, the righteous will live by faith.
Okay. So just think about the context in which both men are writing this. And Paul obviously adapting Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4. Is the context the same? Does Paul kind of bring it forward and use it a little differently, or do you think he's really saying somewhat the same thing? How is Paul using this? What is he, a lot of people look at this as Paul's thematic statement of Romans. Is that a fair assessment? What you know about the book of Romans? All right, I'll give you my assessment. Yeah, I think it is. I think he uses the idea of faith, because he's trying to suggest that the Gentiles and the Jews together, what they have to have is faith. Okay. He doesn't expect that the Gentiles are going to be bound by the law of Moses. He even says, well, the Jews aren't really bound by it anymore. It never was meant to be something that would bring about righteousness, does it? Okay. And he just is suggesting here that he's kind of adapting this from what God has already told Habakkuk. So, is that fair? Is that fair, Paul, to just take this passage and throw it in there as, hey, it's the same thing? I don't know. My suspicion is, like I said earlier, that there's a little bit of extra thing going on here, and that is, I think, even when Paul talks about faith that the Gentiles and Jews have to have, again, it's not just belief. That's the first step to it. But it's also belief and trust. Okay? And really, isn't God telling Habakkuk, you're going to have to trust me on this one? Even if you don't understand what I'm doing, you're going to have to trust me here. So, Paul clearly is, at least it seems to me, we've taken Paul's statement to mean, well, you just have to have belief because, you don't have to try to obey all the law. That's one of the messages in the book of Romans, that the Jews and Gentiles alike come to God through faith. But I don't know, there's just still this, when you get in the latter part of Romans, it becomes very clear that there's this faithfulness part that's still a part of this. And so it seems to me, him adapting this out of Habakkuk gives it a meaning that sometimes we could easily miss if we didn't really recognize where he's getting this passage from in the context of Habakkuk and what Habakkuk has to deal with. Larry, do you have your hand up?
It always amazes me that, Paul, he knew the law, Pharisee of Pharisees and everything, but after his conversion, that he would go back to Jerusalem and talk to a fisherman. And, here's a learned man, and then he wants to know, you are with this man called Jesus, what, he was wanting to know the heart of the man. What's this all about?
Yeah.
Even with all of his intellectual capacities and abilities to understand the law and everything, he realized there is something here.
Mm. Mm. They had to get some more depth to it, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
To his understanding, yeah. Ron?
I like where this verse is used in Hebrews, because it's really the preface to the honor roll of faith. And it, the writer goes on to say, by faith, this guy did this, by faith. So it's not a works-based faith, it is an action-oriented faith.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so that, I like the use of it there.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I agree. I think that the way Habakkuk uses it and the way Paul uses it, I think all through the scripture it's always the same, because I think that you know, our walk is by faith. And like in the Old Testament, the Jews, they couldn't keep the law, and they knew they couldn't keep the law, and they, you know, and so their closeness to God had to come through faith and waiting for God and trusting God for their own eternity. And same as Paul is telling us, and I think that faith is the whole measure of our maturity. Like you said, everybody's in a different place and everything, because ultimately there's no peace until you turn it all over to God, and that's faith and trust. And boy, is that hard to do on a daily basis, to just really turn it over to God, but that's really what it's all about. And when you've achieved that kind of faith, where you can actually, that's when you can actually find peace, and you just let God take care of business, and you don't have to.
Yeah. You know, I've heard people say, well, just let go and let God. Well, it's kind of easy to use jargon, isn't it? That's a kind of statement of jargon. You know, and I think sometimes we sometimes say that to people, and again, I just think it's a little unfair for the particular individual's needs to just pull that piece of jargon out and act like it should be easy. Well, it isn't. It isn't. It wasn't easy for Habakkuk. I'm not convinced it was all that easy for Paul. A lot of other people. And I would just encourage you to kind of relate this to Romans 1:5 and 16:26. I call them bookends to the book of Romans. And it's Paul simply trying to encourage faith that comes, or the obedience that comes by faith. Right? I think sometimes interpreters miss that part of it. Right? And that's why I kind of like the context here from the back. I don't want to go into that. Chapter 3 is a litany of God's works. How do verses 17 through 19 display a profound and lofty expression of personal faith? Somebody read for me, please, chapter 3, verses 17 through 19. Very end of the book.
Though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vine, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exalt the Lord, I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. The Lord God is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds feet, and makes me walk on my high places.
Okay. So, what is Habakkuk's conclusion?
God is in control.
Okay.
Content in every situation.
What's that?
Content in every situation.
I like the sure-footedness of, even if you're in doubt, God is there with you, and
Yeah.
those steps will take you there.
Yeah. it's kind of a hard place to come around to, isn't it? I mean, he's even saying, look, if I don't get, you know, look, if there's no fruit on the, yeah, what does it say? How does it say it? If there's no, no fig tree doesn't blossom, no fruit on the vine, olive crop fails, fields produce no food, and the flocks, he doesn't have anything left. At least the things that we might think of would give us comfort in, you know, our needs and our lives. He says, even if I don't have any of that, I'm kind of okay. Whew. That's something I haven't worked toward yet, but it is something that I think we are called to work toward, isn't it? To have that kind of faith.
Trust.
Yeah, have that kind of trust. I won't say that's, again, we're just dealing with some very choice meat morsels here. That we're trying, that our faith needs to develop to that extent. Powerful, just kind of put that before your face. And just recognize that, you know, God is still there. And that he can give you strength. It was, Isaiah talked about, you know, rising up on wings like eagles if you wait for the Lord. Sometimes the waiting is the hard part. You know, the getting on the wings feels pretty good if you can get there. All right, so anyway, that's my lesson for Habakkuk today. We will talk about Zephaniah in 2 weeks. Ron will give you, I don't know, Ron, how are you going to cover 50 chapters of Jeremiah in one lesson? One chapter. Jeremiah 17, okay? Ron's going to talk about Jeremiah 17. Thank you so much for your
Where are you guys
discussion.
going on your vacation?